Right, good morning. We're here to do the things that people at St Michael's are not very good at. And today it's going to be theme 6 of a 16 mark overview question that we're going to have a go at. Now, first thing to do is, obviously you've got 3 chunks. Chunk 1 is medieval. Okay, so that's everything from 500 to 1500 that's happened in public health. Now, to cut a long story short, public health in medieval times does not exist. Alright, that's the general picture. Most of what you put is going to be fairly negative, and it's important to stress that there's negatives, because obviously if we want to get full marks we've got to emphasise that point about there being some change. Okay, because just telling the story is only going to get you 5, maybe 6 marks at a push for explanation, whereas if you're explaining change, it's going to push you up a balance. So I put here just a few things just to get you started. General big point: towns are unsanitary. In Exeter, give an example here and I like a bit of context, the bridge that crossed the river is known as Shitebrook, obviously, because you can probably guess from the breakdown of the words what was found in the river. Okay? Mortality rates were high, life expectancy was around 35 in town. So generally you just need to write something very, very simple explaining the idea that medieval times there was not much public health, i.e. there was no government interference. Now, we have put though, there was one shining light. And it's a bit unusual because it's a shining light of absolutely nothing today, and that's Coventry. Okay, because in Coventry, 12 pence fine for not cleaning the street in front of your house, which is quite a lot of money back in those days' time. Specified dunghill sites around the edge of town. If you want that explained, that's basically like, you know, you go to the council, you go to your refuse site, you put your recycling in one bucket, your landfill in the other. So they basically had that in medieval times. So you took your turnips to one part of town, and your dead pigs to another, and any other type of waste would go to another one. And they were all around the outskirts of town, so the waste wasn't actually in the town itself. Waste disposal into the River Sherborne was banned, so they made the link between dirty water and problems in public health, which is big. All latrines over a red ditch, which is a stream, were to be removed, which again shows quite clear government interference or government action to deal with the problem of public health. So, in 5 minutes, you need to write a paragraph that covers the medieval period. Think carefully about the opener that I've given you there. You can change that ever so slightly, but you just need to put that into one nice, neat, short and succinct paragraph. You've got 5 minutes, off you go. Paragraph 2, the early modern era. Now, what we've got to do with this is, what you're probably noticing, that we're going to get a bit of a lopsided answer. We're going to have 2 paragraphs that are not very big at all, and then we're going to have one slightly larger chunk at the end. And that's okay, because all you've got to do is finish it. That's all you've got to do. If you finish it, you're going to get substantially more marks than if you do really well for 2 paragraphs. Now, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but the idea is that you're giving an overview or an outline of what it's like over time. So, in the early modern, generally, what we've got to try and say is that there wasn't a lot of change, but there were some bits that were important. So what I put here is, there's a small example in 1500 of Henry VIII passed an Act of Parliament giving towns and cities the authority to build sewers. I put that in as a nice little, just a little bit of context, but it's just a nice little fact that you can use. Okay, but generally I'm scraping around on the ground here for this one because there isn't an awful lot. Now the second one I put the outbreaks of plague. Now you've got to generally say that those were negative. They were deadly. I mean, 68,000 deaths from the plague of 1665 to 66 is huge. So you've got to say that generally there wasn't a great or improved approach to public health. And the reason for that is that, again, there still was not much understanding of medical knowledge, was there? So you can mention that as well. Okay? However, I put here there were some positives. Now we know the approaches to the plague became a little bit more sophisticated. There was a law or regulation passed in London to lay down poison to destroy rats and mice. So obviously they made the link between that. Okay, they also they made sure they did bits of quarantine, didn't they, in London? Although it wasn't able to do it effectively because of the sheer volume of people that lived in London. I've also put, after the Great Fire of London, Parliament passed an act which would give better regulation to the rebuilding of London. So they're going to make the streets wider. Waste was going to have to be disposed of outside of the City of London, things like that. So there was some government interference or some approach to public health or cleaning the place up. Okay? And again, remember, you haven't got to make too much of this, you've just got to put some points. Now, I put EAM because I was really scraping the barrel to try and write about early on. And I thought, well, EAM is an example of a coordinated approach to public health. Now, I wouldn't write too much about EAM, you talk about 3-4 lines at the most, but it's public health, isn't it? Because Mompesson and Stanley, who were in effect the government of EAM, they put together a 3-point plan to deal with the problem of plague spreading out of EAM. So you just briefly mentioned quarantine, you might mention sterilisation. What you generally mention is that it's a coordinated attempt to deal with the problem of plague, so a public health approach. So, if you generally get the main idea that it's negative again, there's not many changes, but there are a few. So you might get the idea if there's continuity with the medieval period. So it's generally the same, but there's a few. If you get that idea across, that's good. Okay, off you go. You've got 5 minutes. Okay, so we've written our paragraphs on medieval, we've written our paragraph on early modern. Now, what we've got to do now is we've got to write about the modern era. Now, you could split that into 2 as I have, or you can just put it as 1 paragraph. It is entirely up to you. Okay, as long as you've got the 3, the examiner's not going to mind how you do it. Okay? Now, I think the important point to start with is in the industrial era, or you can call it the modern era or call it the industrial era, it doesn't matter, it's entirely up to you. I've called it here, I've put both, industrial / modern, but we're talking about the changes, the main changes to public health, some hugely significant ones happened in basically the industrial period. So we are looking at, and again, this is the point across to get more marks, is that we're looking at initially negatives. We're looking at even, you could even say to some extent, backward changes, or things going backwards, or continuity from the previous 2 periods, because the governments are generally, or councils, or whatever you want to call them in Britain, are laissez-faire. You know what that means from America. They want to leave it alone. They don't want to be involved in public health. So the population grows, and with it come the problems of terrible buildings, poor sanitary conditions, i.e. 1 toilet for every 1,000 people, or 1 toilet per street. Okay? You've got life expectancy in industrial cities of 17. So what you've got to do is paint a picture of, initially there were appalling conditions around the UK, a lack of hospitals, and no real coordinated think about public health. You had sewers, open sewers running next to where people got their water from. So you still had the same problems that you've always had, but on a bigger scale because there were more people living in towns and cities. However, changes start to happen, and I put 3 key individuals on the board. Okay, we'll start with Chadwick. He realised that the poor were in poverty due to poor health, not laziness. So it's that move in terms of stigma attached to being poor. He realised that poor were not poor through choice, they were poor because they couldn't get out of being poor, because conditions were, and if obviously if you're ill, you're sick, you can't go to work. So his work led to the first Public Health Act, which is an attempt to get people to clean up their local areas. He was a key member of the Clean Party. He pushed government action to get involved in public health. So we've got to mention Chadwick, because of Chadwick there were 2 Public Health Acts, there was numerous other various different acts, the Sanitary Act, Artisans Dwelling Act. So you can mention any one of those that you can remember, but he basically was the first person to start pushing the clean-up of Britain's towns and cities. Okay, so he's got to get a mention. Perversely though, problem with Chadwick, as we know, is he believed in miasma. So one mistake that he made, the Public Health Act, was to sweep everything into the Thames, which caused the cholera epidemic of 1852, where I think there were over 50,000 deaths in London. Okay, because obviously it contaminated drinking water. So you could mention that although Chadwick is a positive, it's also coupled up with a negative. And the more positives and negative changes you mention, the better the examiner's going to think you are. I've put in here as well Titus Salt, who obviously built Saltaire. And we look at him for public health because he looked after his workers, banned alcohol in the area, there's no pubs in his particular area, built them housing, and generally sort of tried to improve standards and conditions for workers. I've also put Chamberlain from Birmingham. Okay, he basically gas and water socialism, took control of gas and water, then sold it back to the general public. That way money could be raised to rebuild the city and improve it. So you could mention him as we call social reformers. Right? And I've also mentioned Basil Gett, who built the sewers in London. Okay? Housing Act of 1872 is another one. You don't have to mention all of these. One or two of them is more than enough. We generally get across that point that key individuals are responsible for pushing changes. Initially we start with bad, and then the key individuals start to move, to push, to improve. Okay? Now, break this down. I've got another section for the immediate modern, which is 20th century. But if we say 6 minutes on this one, that is about enough time to get this one across. So, off you go. Okay. Now, congratulations, because you've already written the full coverage. So if you've written the full coverage, you know that you've got 8 or more marks in the bank, provided you've not gone off piste and written about Hippocrates and Galen and Mother Shipton. You should be alright. Okay? Now, if you want to basically make this a complete, really good, top-level answer, you'll emphasise that the government now plays a more full role in public health. I.e. the government takes a real interest and is proactive in dealing with public health. And the biggest things are the two that I haven't really paid much credit to. You can mention liberal reforms in NHS, because I don't think there's much bigger for public health than those two things. The NHS effectively looks after our health and welfare, doesn't it? Liberal reforms start to look after old age pensions, free school meals, National Insurance Act, all those sorts of things. You don't need to go into depth about them. You just need to give an overview that the government now takes a far greater interest in public health. We've gone from laissez-faire to the government controls most aspects of public health. It even goes as far as looking after things like, give us a killer smog in 1952. It passed the Clean Air Act. So factories are not allowed to burn fossil fuels like coal. That's why there was a stripping down of resources like coal. New towns were built because the slum housing after the war was deemed insufficient for people to live in. So new towns have been built like Milton Keynes, Peterborough, Northampton. All those are new towns that have been built since the Second World War. And we've gone to the point where actually the government is trying to proactively look after people's health. You've got 5 a day and you've got the Bike to Work scheme. So what you generally need to do with this one is just say, by the end of the 20th century, the government now takes a more proactive approach to public health. And if you just mention a few of those things in there, without going into any real depth, we're talking 5 minutes max, you've finished off what I think is pretty much near to perfect 16 mark response. Okay? Well done guys, off you go, last 5 minutes.